Okay, ladies and gentlemen, after a pretty long hiatus, um, I'm doing another video. My name is Stephen Polgar, um, and this podcast is entitled A Citizen Speaks. I've had many of you subscribe, and I appreciate that, and I hope others will continue. Um, I certainly need the support and appreciate the responses and be more than pleased and happy to answer your questions and provide you more information if you desire that. I'm going to talk about the life or a memory of an unusual man who died in November of this year, and um, we'll read what I've written because that's my preferred way of composing ideas or putting together ideas. So the title is Tibor Pákh, Unbroken Opponent of Communism. When a man is blessed with a long life, one in which he has learned about some of the greatest evil perpetrated against his fellow men, it is uplifting to remember the rare few who strive to approximate the greatest good, who never faltered facing evil and its servants. The Hungarian lawyer and lifelong anti-communist activist, Tibor Pákh, who died in November of this year, was such a man. He belongs to a rare breed of men like the German minister Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who worked during World War II in the anti-Nazi underground with Admiral Canaris, the head of the German military counterintelligence. They were both executed after the last failed attempt to kill Hitler at the end of the war. Both Canaris and Bonhoeffer were humiliated and hung like murderers, Canaris on February 12th and Bonhoeffer on April 9th, 1945, shortly before the collapse of the Nazi regime. By a strange coincidence, I was distantly connected to the family of Canaris' son in Munich, since I dated an English girl who au paired for them not far from the buildings of my employers at Radio Free Europe. Not long after I left that institution, I learned about the fate of Father Jerzy Popiełuszko, the Polish priest assassinated on October 19, 1984, by three agents of the Polish State Security Service, the Służba Bezpieczeństwa. Służba Bezpieczeństwa. Hard to say Polish words. His only crime was openly preaching for the rights of the banned Solidarity Union and naming those who had been imprisoned and calling for their release. Those few examples place Tibor Pákh in a group of people who risked their lives to fight dictatorships. What is important is that this list has not stopped growing. Now that dictatorships in China, North Korea, and elsewhere continue to persecute, imprison, and kill their opponents. Facts and dates do not reflect justly the story of Tibor Pákh's life. It is his acts of defiance and the incredibly brutal response of the powers he challenged which bear the testimony of his character. He was imprisoned in the Soviet Gulag after World War II as a prisoner of war, and when he was allowed to return to Hungary in 1948, he and his family, branded kulaks, rich farmers, were stripped of their properties. He studied law at the Pázmány Péter University of the Sciences in Budapest and specialized in international jurisprudence, but because of his status as a class enemy, was only able to find a job as an engineering translator at the Chapel Motor Works. In 1954, he married Edith, who became the faithful love of his life. The brief details of his life are available in English at the website identified in the notes of this video. Pákh's extensive recollections are at the other website listed there. I may take a stab at translating this into English, since besides the facts themselves, which range from the humiliating pettiness of the methods that agents of the communist dictatorship used to grind down opponents as brave as Pákh, to the horrifying tortures performed by the communist psychiatrist Mengele, who subjected him to 150 electroshock therapies, there are also expressions of his Catholic faith which helped him survive these tortures. His character shines through his unpretentious style. Reading about his trials and tribulations and his uncompromising, ceaseless attacks on the evil arrayed against him is reminiscent of stories from the lives of the saints tortured and murdered for the Christian faith. A privileged man living in the comforts and luxuries of a North American metropolis, reading about crimes committed against men like Pákh, feels compelled to spread his story to as many of his lucky fellow citizens as possible. Few of us know how blessed we are, and few of us can imagine the humiliations and torture that was such a part of his life. The reason that it is important to talk about brave, saintly men like Pákh is because the danger that we may lose our incredible freedoms is threatening our society and those in Europe, the part of the world that used to be known as the West. We live in an age when incredibly complex networks of power based on money and vast bureaucracies replace personal dictatorships like those of Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. The most concrete example of the latter is Communist China, which has succeeded in establishing a totalitarian dictatorship unlike its predecessors. Instead of a monolith run by a small handful of bosses closely tied to one leader, the Chinese have perfected the first communist oligarchy which bases its power on hundreds of millions of followers. When a country's population is over 1.2 billion people, the number of co-opted and committed bureaucrats needed to run the military and the government bureaucracy could be somewhere between 10 to 25%. That is 120 to roughly 30 million people. But consider those numbers. The latter is nearly the population of the United States. That many could certainly keep the others subjugated, especially in a country whose history is characterized by emperors and communist dictators. It took someone as smart as Deng Xiaoping to understand this. He knew that giving even a modest material reward to people who live only for comfort and personal security is a much better way to keep them in hand than endless terror. As the first post-Mao communist leader in China, he introduced the communist capitalist hybrid system, which relied on the party and its minions of police, military, and bureaucratic authority that constituted China's new social structure, emulating the ancient one. That, the ancient one, consisted of the Shi, nobles, scholars, and officials, the Nong, peasant farmers, the Gong, artisans and craftspeople, the Shang, merchants and traders, and the slaves. Now the equivalents are striking. The only change involves the merchants and traders who have been moved up above the peasant farmers. Today's Chinese slaves who are in prison work camps probably outnumber their ancestors who constituted 1% of that country's population. But even if they do not, 1% is still 120 million slaves who do some of the most horrific labor known to man. They provide an enormous base for Chinese communist society and are a constant reminder for those who dare to question the way that country is run. They are the descendants subjected to the most extreme terror, removal from society, and erasure from memory. So why describe the Chinese communist capitalist hybrid system, which in an older time was called fascist and defined as state-centralized capitalism? Because there's an insidious reflection of that model developing in our country and Europe. Here, the hybrid is a capitalist communist, which is an oligarchical concentration of wealth based in a pseudo-socialist ideology that simplifies the solution of the problems of the world and its inhabitants. Just like socialist and communist ideologies, it reduces problems like population growth, the limits of our environmental resources, social inequalities, changes in climate, to a few cliches, or as its opponents like to call them, paradigms. These are usually either inadequate to explain problems or to lead to realistic solutions. As shibboleths, they are either obsolete at their coining or prove to be when attempts are made to act on them. The scary part of this Western obverse of the Chinese model, which emulates it in its possible political consequences, is that there are enormous financial powers arrayed to support it. Corporations whose yearly funds often exceed the gross national product of large countries, and which in combination could challenge the US or China, are influencing the decisions of governments and ostensibly have paid off major political leaders to represent their interests. They, with their Chinese communist capitalist counterparts, are hurling the world in an unimaginably evil direction. The future they are devising has no role for the individual. There will be no identity or autonomy. When men will be either agents of megalithic bureaucracies or slaves working on their peripheries without rights. What does that have to do with men like Pákh? He was one of those willing to stand up alone against the megalithic communist system, like the lone Chinese protester in Tiananmen Square who stood up to the Red Army tanks on June 4th, 1989. He never wavered in his Catholic faith, and I can't find a better proof of the power of that faith than Pákh's ability to maintain his mental stability and physical strength to the age of 98. No doctor would have ever predicted that fate for a man who suffered torture and humiliation as much as he had. Even priests may have wondered at the miracle of his long life. I've tried to understand what gave men like Pákh the motivation and strength to live their lives the way they did. My 22-year-old uncle Tamás died of hunger and diphtheria in a Nazi forced labor camp in Bissingen near Frankfurt, Germany on New Year's Eve in 1944. He had bravely and carelessly resisted the Nazi occupiers of Hungary and tried to protect persecuted Jews in Budapest, and was arrested and taken to that camp. They worked him to death repairing railroad tracks blown up by Allied bombers. I witnessed the grief and suffering he bequeathed to my grandmother Paula and to my mother. I always wondered whether he could have lived differently and fought more subtly against the Nazis and spared the sorrow and anguish of his surviving family. It took many years to understand that there were no alternatives possible for a man who believed in justice and freedom as he did, just as there were no alternatives for Pákh. Their examples prove that greater powers are at work leading our lives and determining our fates, as men have believed for so many thousands of years. Pákh's wife delivered a baby son soon after he was imprisoned in 1960. But the boy died after 10 days, and she never gave birth again. For the rest of her lonely life, while her husband was in prison, and then the few years in which they lived together, she collected dolls. They were a sad reminder of her inability to raise children. Pákh must have been affected by this hiatus in their life, but he did not write about how he managed to live with it. For a father and grandfather, it is terrifying to imagine life without children. It conjures questions about completeness. Maybe Pákh and his wife were destined to struggle with this incompleteness. Maybe that was the reason Pákh was given reserves of strength unavailable to most of us. His family, his children were his fellow countrymen for whose lives and rights he suffered so extremely. His self-denial, his sacrifice was for them instead of for his own children. Maybe that is why he was granted such incredible mental and physical powers and a long life to fight for his subjugated, enslaved countrymen. That's it. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you liked the video. And if you did, please express your support and click the like button. And again, if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer. The details of Pákh's life, and both in English and in Hungarian, the websites will be under the video on YouTube and in Rumble. Okay, thank you. And again, appreciate you listening. Bye-bye.